Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Let's turn now, though, to the story which is dominating the news today, and that's the collapse of Britain's second largest construction firm, Carillion. The company employs 20,000 people in the UK, and its work stretched from the HS2 rail project and military contracts to maintaining hospitals, schools and prisons. Now, there are plenty of questions being asked about the collapse, from the hefty pay packets given to the company's bosses to what support the government is giving to the firm's employees and contractors, not to mention the eventual cost to the taxpayer. Our correspondent Chris Mason has been following it all closely. Chris, the government is no doubt starting to count the cost in more ways than one of Carillion going under. It said there would be no taxpayer bailout, but what is it committed to paying in terms of people's jobs and wages?
It's a huge challenge, this, Jo. So the government has said that in the short term its focus is on ensuring that the services that Carillion is meant to deliver can be delivered, whether that be the provision of school meals, for instance, or cleaning hospitals. But yeah, as you say, there is then the vast consequences in the medium and long term. So what about that giant pension deficit, for instance? What about all of those smaller firms who were subcontractors of Carillion? Around 30,000 firms, one trade body suggesting this morning, are effectively customers of Carillion. Huge question marks around how they are going to be paid for work that they've done and that they say they are owed money for. And so what has happened is the government set up its Cobra committee that met last night. There was a whole wave of ministers, a march of ministers into the Cabinet Office last night from all over Whitehall, which really painted the picture of the extent to which the tentacles of Carillion run into all aspects of the public sector. Cabinet has been meeting this morning. There's a briefing for Westminster journalists happening right now on those Cabinet discussions. No doubt Carillion a big topic there. And then there's the bigger question that very much is being seized upon by Jeremy Corbyn and Labour, which is to pose that question that hasn't really been a staple of mainstream politics for quite a while now, which is to what extent should private sector firms have a big involvement in the delivery of public sector work? We saw the Blair and Brown governments under Labour being very comfortable with the likes of Carillion and others being involved in the delivery of public services. The Coalition and the Conservatives have been keen on that as well. Labour's Jeremy Corbyn very keen to say that there should be a shift away from what he sees as the outsource first dogma. So I think that's going to be the, if you like, the coming political battle,
yes,
given the gap that there is now between Labour and the Conservatives on the instinct about how this is delivered.
The other side, of course, which will anger the public, is the issue of salaries and bonuses that have been paid and to some extent are still continuing to be paid to the senior staff and executives at Carillion. Now, the Department of Business has just put out the following release asking for investigation into directors to be fast-tracked. Do you think that'll be enough to assuage the anger of people looking at what has been called in some papers fat cat bonuses?
Yeah, I think there's a keen awareness, Jo, in government about just how toxic this is, because on the one hand you've got, as I say, these 30,000 firms, small and medium-sized businesses, the very kind of people and entrepreneurs that every political party, but particularly the Conservatives, are always keen to appeal to, who are worried about getting paid. And on the other hand, talk of these vast amounts of money being paid out to senior executives. Now, there was a real awareness yesterday, I think it'll be reflected again today within government, that there shouldn't be a sense of rewards for failure. There shouldn't be a sense of, if you like, socialising losses whilst privatising huge gains and profits. So yeah, there'll be an acute awareness about how that is handled. Now, the government's been saying that that's in the hands at the moment of the official receiver, but I think you can expect the rhetoric from the very top on this to continue to be pretty sharp.
Chris Mason, thank you. Well, he mentioned the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, and he's issued some strong words on the subject of Carillion, and here he is in a message posted online last night.
In the wake of the collapse of the contractor Carillion, it's time to put an end to the rip-off privatisation policies that have done serious damage to our public services and fleeced the public of billions of pounds. This is a watershed moment.
Well, that was the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn in a message online. So is this a watershed moment, as he claims? And do the public agree? Well, Ellie Price has been out with entirely unscientific Daily Politics Mood Box to find out.
It's become a fact of life. Private companies are involved in everything, from our schools to our prisons, our railways to our hospitals. Some say when it comes to efficiency, business knows best, while others say it's an experiment that's run its course. So, is public ownership back in fashion? That's what we're asking today. Who would you rather see run your public services? The private or the public sector? Thanks very much.
It depends very much on which public services you're talking about and how well they're going to be funded if it's the public sector and how the deal is going to be brokered if it's the private sector.
We don't want waste, we want money to be spent well and for the taxpayer to get good value and go in that bucket there. Okay.
The private sector, it doesn't really work, and the profit motive is overwhelming.
I think it's a massive question needs to be asked: what is the role of the public sector and how much can be actually delegated to individual people to make their own economic decisions in life?
Thank you. But is it more efficient if you're a private company?
Oh yeah, it is, but efficiency comes at a cost, is the problem.
I think prisons, should revert back to public. Trains, probably public. The private companies seem to be greedy.
Oh, it's a rainbow.
I think the combination's optimal, but public.
Oh God! Oh, it's running away. Oh.
Because I'm an anarchist.
Oh, okay. How do you have a railway if you don't have a private sector or a public sector?
Because everyone's going to join together as people and we'll all create our own little unions that will manage it.
I think there's some lessons to take from the private sector, sort of efficiencies and that kind of thing. But on the whole, you need to have that kind of thing being looked after by someone who's not trying to make a profit out of it.
I think it should be the public sector, but probably at the moment the private sector is looking after it better.
Well, the day is drawing to a close, and so too is our mood box. And while a number of people said a healthy combination is a good idea, overall the winner here at least was pretty clear. The public sector should look after our public services.
Ellie Price there. Well, a fairly decisive result in the decidedly non-scientific mood box there. But to discuss Carillion and the public-private debate more generally, we're joined by Mick Cash, General Secretary of the RMT Union, and my guest of the day, Anna Soubry, is a former business minister. Before I come to you, Mick Cash, first of all, just on some of the fundamentals, Anna Soubry, in terms of what's going to happen to the staff as make up part of Carillion's workforce. 62% of Carillion's work is in the private sector, and that could be thousands of employees on private contracts. Should the government also guarantee their salaries?
Look, my first port of call on this is actually the workforce, and for a lot of those people they will be extremely worried about, frankly, whether they're going to get paid this week or this month.
Only till tomorrow, they've been told.
Exactly. So having been involved in the closure, remember, of a steelworks up in Redcar, there are ways that government can get involved in things to make sure that monies are made available so workers are paid. There are discrete methods often, and that certainly happened in SSI, where we made damn sure that people were paid in the face of those men not being, they're mainly men, not being paid.
So you think, as well as guaranteeing the wages of the public sector workers, those with public sector contracts, the government should further extend that to the private sector?
No, I'm not saying that. Because I'm not getting into that sort of detail, because I know how those things get spun out. What I'm saying is that there will be ways that the government can make sure that they do everything they can to ensure that those men and women are paid for the work that they have done, and they should use whatever levers they've got to do that. And trust me, there are ways that these things can be done.
Why should employees employed by private sector companies without public sector contracts also be bailed out, if you like, or paid by the taxpayer, the government?
Well, depends what you mean by private sector contracts. Carillion do a lot of work on the railways and other contracts, and are they private or public? So it'll be an interesting point to find out what you mean by private and public, because they've blurred the line completely since they've outsourced the previous governments into the private public arena. So I'd ask that first question, what do you mean by that? Because ultimately a lot of the work actually is guaranteed by the taxpayer. It's publicly funded, and in those circumstances then we should be looking after those workers, because if we don't, the economy is going to suffer. But equally,
well, how long should they be looked after?
Well, you know, we're in that situation where we've done it before. You know, banks got bailed out. You know, we've seen bails out of southern and east coast trains by the government. They're prepared to give them money, and in actual fact, you'll find that a lot of these workers, they've got contracts that are working to. The issue is the company is not trading, but there are contracts and there's work.
Right, now there are contracts. They're not public sector contracts in that sense, but if they are providing services, these employees on the railways as cleaners and catering, do you still pay?
Well, you'll continue. Public sector clear things like the delivery of school meals, the cleaning of hospitals, things like that. For example, in something I have some knowledge of, which is the MOD, the delivery of the service accommodation contracts. These contracts can be delivered upon because somebody else can be found to do that work, because that work can't and won't stop.
Well, does that reassure you then?
Very different to the point that you rightly make. Sorry, I think we're in agreement about this, about when do other sorts of contracts actually cross over into a new way that really was introduced by the last government.
We've got members at this moment don't know whether they're going to get paid. They've done work for Network Rail over Christmas. They work for a private sector operator. They're plant operators. Are they going to get paid? We don't know. Yeah. One of the aspects of all of this, by the way, and Anna seems to be very certain about this. I'm not, because I've spoken to the chief executive of Network Rail. I've spoken to the special manager appointed by the administrators to find out actually who's public, who's private, who's going to get paid, and we don't know. And the lack of preparedness by the government in all of this to answer these questions, I think, is shocking.
Well, let's talk about the preparedness. Do you think the government, Anna Soubry, fundamentally dropped the ball in its dealing with this firm over the last 6 to 9 months?
I genuinely don't know. What I do know, because I used to be a business minister, is that you are always kept alert. In any event, we were all alert publicly because they had their profits warning back in July. Mm-hmm. So it was clear that this was a company in deep trouble.
So should they have had more government contracts awarded?
Well, that's always that is the very difficult question, and I'm not able to answer it because I don't know enough about it. But it would seem that this is a very difficult one. As government, do you help somebody, or are you cognizant of the fact that they could be in very deep trouble, in which event it could be argued it's not a good thing to do. What I'm confident has happened is that the Secretary of State for Transport in particular will have received advice on that, and if he didn't, I would be rather surprised.
Right, but do you share some of the civil servants who seem to be broadly relaxed that this is what happens, firms succeed and firms fail?
Well, that is true. That's a market economy which Labour used to support.
Right, is that the case? Anna Soubry brings up the Labour Party supporting that. Is this, though, a watershed moment? Is this different in the way that Jeremy Corbyn has characterised it than a major company failing and all of the problems that actually brings?
I mean, it shows that outsourcing has failed, the model's broken, and actually we need to bring more back into public hands. I mean, if you're in the private sector, by the way, if you're a chief executive, you get wads of money. If you're shareholders, you get wads of money. And then if the company goes bust, it's the creditors, a lot of them workers at the sharp end, who pay the price. So
you missed the point.
Well, hang on, is outsourcing, have we reached the end of the road with outsourcing?
No.
Is it time for a review? Even David Liddington, your colleague, seemed to imply there should be a review.
Right, so let me this is my take on things. One of the big problems that we have is that when we are putting out these big contracts, they invariably go to very big companies, and the medium and small businesses are not included in the way that they should be. So big companies like Carillion, which had an incredible spread of work, which I find rather odd in any event, they get these contracts because government has a responsibility to get the cheapest price to get value for the taxpayer. And then what happens is they can't deliver it.
So whose fault is that? I mean, these things are...
Well, let me explain. So I think we have a problem in the procurement and tendering at both a national and local level because it's too much for these very big companies because you tend to get what you pay for. So I've got some experience from MOD.
Right.
And my concern was, because this may help you, it'll help you as well, Mick. My concern was, because we've got to be honest about these.
But why not take them back in-house then? I mean, if in the end the taxpayer is having to bail out to some extent.
Please let me just explain what the problem was. So what would happen is that a very big company would say, we can deliver this contract for this amount of money. And people would say, well, we've got to go for the lowest bid, without drilling down, remembering you get what you pay for.
All right.
And then they'd subcontract and subcontract, so you ended up almost in a position where to deliver that contract successfully was almost impossible.
I understand.
Unless you didn't pay people decent money, which concerns me, and you didn't
just
provide
making the point for bringing
the
it into
service.
public sector.
No, I didn't.
You actually
I made the point.
Let him answer. Let him answer.
Undercutting and just driving down costs for the profit margin. No, it's not. It's about the profit margin. All they want to do is make money out of this, and to do that, they're going to use taxpayers' money. And when things fail, it's the taxpayer picks up the tab.
I'm old enough to remember when all these things were in the public sector, and it didn't deliver value for money. I don't like the Labour Party always introduced this huge outsourcing, and rightly so. The watershed moment is that this shows the drift in the Labour Party back to the 70s, back to a Marxist way of doing things, which is all about state control. Let the market properly control.
Let him respond.
I'm old enough to remember when it was in the public sector, and equally, by the way, I used to be employed by Carillion Rail when they were doing the maintenance contracts for Network Rail, who brought it in-house and saved almost £400 million a year by just bringing their maintenance in-house back in 2004. So we're in that situation where we do know that actually the private sector costs money because they've got the profit motive, they've got to deal with the shareholders. The public sector actually saves money and every bit of money that gets spent or is earned actually goes back into the service.
What differentiates me
because we're running out of time.
I'm not ideologically driven. So I want something that works. I'll take private, and if it's right to do it in-house, I'll do it in-house.
And is it right to take it in? Is it right now in this case to take it in-house?
Privatisation, we've seen that.
Driven, and the private sector is out, and it's all about state control. Should
the private sector be involved in delivering public services in the way they have here? Because it seems that privatisation means profits are privatised and losses are nationalised.
No, what it's all about is delivering the best value for the taxpayer. And the point I was making, which I thought...
No, you're not. How are you? Have you seen examples of this?
Talk one at a time, and then I'll let you go.
I'm not ideologically driven. There is a real role for the private sector to play, but it's got to be done in a better way.
Why do the private sector want to do public sector work? Why do they want to do it? Well, to make profit, to make money.
Are you saying, though, that every private sector...
Hang on, that's what pays your workers' wages.
Actually, that's the taxpayer
That's what keeps our economy going, so we get the great public services.
All right.
And that says more about the Labour Party and the state it's in. Back to Marxism, back to the Trotskyism of the 1970s.
So it's Labour Party's fault what's happened with Carillion, then?
No.
So that's Marxism. That's what's caused the Carillion.
Your solution is Marxism.
So that's
what's caused that, is it?
Mick, one question, though. Is it still your view that everything private is bad and public is always good?
Well, yeah, at the end of the day, you're in that situation where, the profit motive just drives, takes money out of the public sector.
All right, and finally to you, do you think the Chief Executive should have his bonus clawed back? £660,000 a year until October 2018.
That's the ex-Chief Executive.
Yep. Yeah. Should it be clawed back?
He's got a conscience, another Chief Executive.
Should it be clawed back?
Well, that's up to him. He's got a conscience. He should do the right thing. It's not for me to tell him what to do. He should know himself. What I will say is this. It's absolutely... Hang on, because of... Look...
let her answer her question. But to be brave, Anna, you normally are. Do you think he should just be deprived of that massive amount of money?
You've paid him the money.
Well, there is a regulator that could deprive him.
Can I just say that I'm very pleased to see the government is accelerating those very strict rules about directors. This is important stuff, and if you are found to have done something wrong, the consequences are huge for you as a director, and rightly so.
Mick, thank you for coming in.
Thank you.
The government's ordered a fast-track investigation into what went wrong at the failed construction firm Carillion. The company, which also runs services in schools, hospitals and prisons, went into liquidation yesterday after running up huge debts. Concerns are growing for small businesses connected to the firm amid fears some could collapse. One industry body estimates that 30,000 companies are owed money. Now, the Business Secretary has ordered a swift investigation into the role and conduct of the company's directors, past and present. Here's our business editor, Simon Jack.
Just how many workers for Carillion and its subcontractors will be leaving their current jobs for good? Carillion owes Andy Bradley £1 million. £1 million he doesn't expect to get paid. Outside his office, 2 chairs that are now empty.
It's devastating. These are people I've known for years and years, and they've been loyal, hard-working individuals, helped get to the business to where it is today. But they were non-frontline, non-essential staff, marketing, bit of admin, things like that. So we had to let them go. We had no choice.
And how did they take it?
Badly, yeah, very badly. One lady I don't know if you, just as you arrived, she came in, we had to let her go. She left in tears.
After the shock of yesterday, the real impact is beginning to hit home at companies like this grounds maintenance firm in Cambridgeshire. Of their 90 staff, they had to let 10 go yesterday, another 1 today. And there's confusion. Will I get paid for work I do from now on? And even if I do, can that possibly make up for the money that I'm owed by Carillion for months past? For many companies like this one, it could be the end of the road.
That confusion is turning to anger, particularly at former bosses, like Richard Howson, who left Carillion after the first profit warning in July 2017. He took home £1.5 million in 2016 and is due to receive a £660,000 salary till October. Keith Cochrane took over the reins in September on a salary of £750,000. And tough questions for the finance director, Zafar Khan, who was looking after the company's accounts when the crisis hit.
Well, it's gone under. 20,000 jobs are directly at risk. A large number of supply chain jobs are at risk. Those people that worked so hard over Christmas on Carillion-based rail contracts, I'm not sure they've been paid. And the directors have done very well out of Carillion, and the chief executive has had a massive payoff.
The spotlight will also fall on the company's auditors, KPMG, who provided the reports directors used to give the company a clean bill of health just 4 months before a massive profit warning. The government has promised an investigation into the company's collapse.
It's vital that we look back and find out what went wrong. And I know that the Business Secretary, Greg Clark, is going to make sure that no stone is left unturned in order to establish just where responsibility lies for the collapse of the company.
Some jobs were stopped just as they were starting. Jay Smith was an apprentice at a Carillion training centre.
I feel very concerned now as to what I'm now going to do, because Carillion was a place where I wanted to work full time. It was somewhere that I wanted to be. And then now, because of all this happening, I have no idea what's going to happen.
Well, obviously we're looking for a positive response.
Union leaders arrived in Westminster looking for answers as well. The post-mortem of this construction giant is just beginning. Simon Jack, BBC News.
Well, John Pienaar is at Westminster for us now. And so many jobs, so many companies involved, still a lot of confusion. How much is the government doing to manage the collapse of this company?
Well, ministers are doing their best to keep tabs through their officials in committee on how services are carrying on, as they promised that they would. And the Treasury has provided a line of credit that could run into many, many millions to make sure that that happens. But still, they're feeling the pressure. Westminster feels a bit like a scalp hunt just now. Even as the TUC were calling for a full inquiry, one committee of MPs were announcing an inquiry into the handling of contracts, and another one is going to be looking at the use of public money. It's a safe bet, Sophie, that there will be a fresh look at government procurement policy after this. Today, I've been hearing of talk in Whitehall that these companies could have to pass new stress tests to show their businesses are sound before they can get these contracts. But the opposition want more than that. We know Jeremy Corbyn is using this argument, jumping in to argue against the role of private sectors in public companies, in public services. Fact is, it could all be overtaken by events. Authoritative voices in the city, Sophie, are saying that these big companies, far from creaming off billions in easy profits, are living on very, very tight margins, and no one can rule out another collapse. Now, if that happens, it would light a fire under this whole debate about the use of these private firms and the extent to which they're used at all.
John Pienaar in Westminster, thank you.
The government has ordered a fast-track investigation into what role the highly paid directors of Carillion played in the firm's collapse. It came as suppliers to the government contractor warned that they're owed millions of pounds, and some have already started to lay off staff. Documents leaked tonight reveal that creditors could receive less than a penny in every pound. The government insists there will be no bailout. Our business editor Joel Hills has more.
In Cambridge, one of Carillion's suppliers is fighting to stay in business. This company maintains the grounds of schools, hospitals and prisons. Carillion owes it £1 million. The owner believes that money's lost and he's laid off 10 staff.
We've been assured that payments will be made for everything from yesterday. For us, the problem is the November and December invoices, which will be very difficult for a business of our size to trade out of that.
The government has pledged to continue funding all of Carillion's public sector contracts, but will stop supporting private sector work after tomorrow. This site in London was deserted today. Some of the projects, like this one that Carillion won, were worth tens of millions of pounds, but a lot of that money tended to end up in the pockets of suppliers because Carillion would subcontract much of the project work, or at least it would eventually. Carillion would force suppliers to wait up to 120 days for payment. In Birmingham, this project was also on pause today. Developers are working out whether or not to terminate complex contracts with Carillion. Suppliers can only hope for the best.
We're looking at 3, 4, 5 layers of subcontracting within those supply chains. So the point is that they're all going to be losing money, and a lot of them are small businesses, and we're talking about possibly large amounts of money here.
Richard Howson collected nearly £600,000 in performance-related pay for 2016. Months later, he stood down after a spectacular profits warning and the share price fell. Interestingly, he's due to continue being paid until October, a basic salary of £660,000 and almost £30,000 in benefits. And he's not alone. His replacement, Keith Cochrane, is set to be paid his salary of £750,000 until July.
Business Secretary Greg Clark is going to make sure that no stone is left unturned in order to establish just where responsibility lies for the collapse of the company.
When Carillion failed, the government inherited a right old mess. The plan is to minimise disruption. Perfectly sensible, but it may not work.
As you say, a right old mess, Joel. And you have figures, I understand, that reveal the financial situation is actually worse than was first thought.
Yeah, we've seen a copy of a witness statement that Keith Cochrane, the interim CEO, submitted to the High Court when the company went into a liquidation on Monday, Mary. And they're really fascinating reading. What they show is that the company was spelling out to government for weeks before it actually went bust just how dire the situation was. It warned of stark consequences both for staff and the taxpayer. And it revealed that the company's problems are actually far worse than, as we say, had been widely reported. Carillion's debts position, as it went into liquidation, stood at £1.6 billion. And creditors, this is the key point, Mary, for those suppliers we've heard from today, they're expected to get back as little as 0.8 pence in the pound. That will worry an awful lot of people that are still owed an awful lot of money by Carillion. Among them, the taxman. HMRC was owed £75 million by Carillion. Keith Cochrane, in his witness statement, Mary, also points the finger at Royal Bank of Scotland. He thinks some of the lenders took unilateral action to undermine the group's effort to preserve cash, something that Royal Bank of Scotland strongly denies. But this is getting heated now because the stakes are so high, because so many suppliers relied on this business to keep alive.
Extraordinary stuff. Joel, thank you very much indeed.
After a massive corporate failure, the search for answers. Ministers are demanding a fast-tracked and expanded investigation into whether bosses at the construction firm Carillion caused it to collapse. They want the inquiry to include all former directors and to examine whether any detriment was caused to creditors or pension scheme members. It's thought up to 30,000 small businesses which dealt with Carillion contracts could be owed cash, with unpaid bills which could go back months. Our business editor, Siobhan Kennedy, reports.
If you want a snapshot of the pain inflicted on small companies by the collapse of the construction giant Carillion, this is it. Birmingham-based Glendale Metalworks was offered a £300,000 contract to supply handrails to the new flagship hospital being built by Carillion just up the road.
We had the contracts on our desks for 3 months and we weren't going to sign them because of the reputation they had. In the finish, we went against our better judgment and took them on.
The handrails were duly delivered, but the cash wasn't. Carillion still owed the company £120,000. As of Friday, they were reassured the payment was imminent. But yesterday morning, they received an email confirming their worst fears. The payment, the message read, would not be processed.
You think they're such a big company that it's not going to happen, but it did.
So do you think you'll see that money?
No. No, definitely not. The people that work direct for them, they'll get paid because they'll get bailed out by the government, but we won't as contractors.
If this example shows us anything, it's the sharp practices around pay and contractual obligations that Carillion allegedly put upon the companies it subcontracted its work to. What's emerging from the numerous firms we've spoken to is an innate distrust of Carillion and what they describe as an aggressive management culture. And it's that and the conduct of directors that will now be scrutinised as part of the government's wider probe into the company. So who might be in the frame? The former chief executive Richard Howson, who joined in 2012. He left after Carillion's July profit warning, but can keep on receiving his $660,000 annual salary until October. Zafar Khan, the finance director, for less than a year. He also left after the profit warnings and is entitled to his $425,000 pay this year. Richard Adam, who was finance director from its heyday in 2007 until 2016, when he left the company. And chairman Philip Green, a former Downing Street advisor on corporate responsibility. He joined in 2014 and was at the helm throughout the 3 profit warnings, but is still in place.
If there's a company that is issuing profit warnings, and it's a huge company, then surely it's the government's job to intervene, to protect those jobs and protect the contracts they're doing, building contracts and many other things. They fail to intervene.
In less than 20 years, Carillion rose through rapid acquisition of rivals like McAlpine and Molam to become Britain's second biggest construction firm, with 43,000 employees and contracts covering great swathes of government services, including hospitals, schools, roads and defence sites. Despite the glossy marketing, underneath the company's foundations were weakening. Come 2016, its aggressive pursuit of contracts meant it was operating on wafer-thin margins, so that when costs started to spiral, debts quickly mounted, reaching £1 billion when Carillion finally fell into liquidation yesterday morning. The government has since sought to contain the fallout by stepping in to provide funding for Carillion's vast public projects, like Birmingham's £430 million Metropolitan Hospital. You can see here that for the second day in a row, this site remains empty. There are no workers here, despite government guarantees that they would continue to fund this massive hospital project. One source here telling me that despite being reassured that they would get paid until at least the end of the month, the workers have simply chosen not to turn up. Their jobs should be safe, but at this landscaping firm, which is still owed £800,000 by Carillion, they've already had to lay off staff.
Yesterday I had 90, today I've got 80. It's as simple as that. The frontline staff are continuing to work under PwC, who are the administrators of the Carillion estate, and we've been assured that payments will be made for everything from yesterday. For us, the problem is the November and December invoices, which will be very difficult for a business of our size to trade out of that.
And thousands more jobs could be lost when the government's 48-hour window of financial support for Carillion's private sector employees ends tomorrow. Well, John, yesterday was all about the shock collapse of the company and the reasons cited by Carillion itself as to its demise. It had too much debt, it said. The banks refused to lend it any more money, and there was a shortage of new contracts coming in. Well, the focus today has shifted very much from what they said was happening at the time and what those same directors were actually doing themselves. The business secretary clearly seeing the need today to widen his investigation and, in his words, in his ominous words, any evidence, he said, of misconduct will be taken very seriously. Now, I spoke today to one very senior source close to the board, and they themselves are beginning to question the reasons behind Carillion's collapse. Was it incompetence or panic, or more than that, the source said? I genuinely don't know. Certainly the pressure, John, on those who were running the company at the time is now being ratcheted up on all sides. Back to you.
Siobhan Kennedy at a very much functioning factory up there in Wolverhampton. Now, the Conservative MP Bernard Jenkin, who's chair of the Public Administration Committee, has ordered an inquiry into Whitehall's handling of private sector contracts. And he's in Westminster. Thanks very much for joining us, Bernard Jenkin. So let's ask you the question we asked at the top of the programme. Is this just one bad company, or is the whole system rotten?
Well, it would be very rash to draw a very broad and general conclusion from the experience of one company when there are thousands of private companies delivering thousands of private contracts, delivering public services very, very successfully, which is why every modern government in the world uses private companies to deliver public services. But that does not mean that there isn't plenty to learn from this terrible fiasco, and that is what our inquiry will be about. It will be making sure that the lessons of this are properly learned.
The issue, though, surely is the fact that we're talking here of Carillion being one of 8 or 10 of these mega companies that lash together all these small companies delivering, yes, as you say, the private sector's capacity to build prisons or whatever it is. But the problem surely is that there's such a small pool of these very big companies that the government is sort of forced to contract with one or other of them. How healthy are all the rest?
Well, I think that's a very legitimate question. And one of the things we'll want to ask is why do we have this preferred bidder system, which makes the perhaps false assumption that bigger companies are less risky than medium-sized or small companies. Whitehall tends to try and do the less risky thing, but very often when they think they're offloading risk and diminishing risk, they're in fact adding to risk. And obviously concentrating so much spending on such a small pool of companies is obviously one of the things that adds risk. But as government becomes more skilled and capable of letting and managing contracts, it should be able to let contracts to a much bigger variety of companies, get more competitive rates, manage those contracts in a more sophisticated way, and deliver better public services as a consequence of better value for money.
As you would be the first to point out, this is going to be a very expensive learning experience. We don't know how much this is going to cost the taxpayer. How long is it going to take the government to learn how to work with these very big companies? Well, I mean, we can't afford it. Not if it's going to cost us what Carillion's going to cost us.
Yes, but the implication of your question is that we shouldn't do this. We shouldn't contract public services to private companies.
I'm asking you about the very point you've made, which is that it's a bad idea to have just 8 or 10 of these mega companies handling all these private contracts. That is not criticising the private sector's involvement. It's criticising the way this government's doing business. Well, why are we doing business with 8 or 10 mega companies that don't work?
I've got the point. The answer is we should be trying to expand the pool. And one of the things that I have been suggesting, and I suggested yesterday to the government in my committee, is that this pool of public service contracts, which is a viable business coming out of Carillion, why couldn't that be sold to an employee company, an employee-owned company, so the people actually delivering the contracts own their own business? We want new players into this market, not to see all these contracts gobbled up by the usual suspects.
OK, Bernard Jenkin, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much indeed.
If we swing our camera slightly around, we'll be joined from Westminster by the Shadow Business Secretary, Rebecca Long-Bailey, who's very kindly come out of a pretty busy session in Parliament today. Rebecca Long-Bailey, let's just pick up this whole question of whether it is private supplying of business and construction and the rest of it to prison service, hospitals, schools, the rest of it, or whether in fact it's these mega companies that are trying to do this on behalf of the state. What is your criticism?
Well, I think it's both. Firstly, I think we need to look at risk. We've seen Carillion as an example of the level of risk that government has exposed itself to. It's granted a number of contracts to one single company, and potentially we're looking at a house of cards about to collapse. There are also questions raised about the government's handling of its own procurement processes, which is why we've called for a full and transparent investigation. Why did it continue to procure services from a company that had issued profit warnings despite government guidance stating that it shouldn't do that? Now, the other element that we need to consider is the risk element. in conjunction with the government's procurement strategy going forward. Is it right to procure services from private organisations? I think there's a question to be asked about cost effectiveness to the taxpayer, and I think this discussion will go on for months now.
Well, your leader, Jeremy Corbyn, seems to have answered that already. He says it's the end of the road for this particular way of doing business.
I think it certainly raises a number of questions, and he's right to say that. I mean, we look at PFI, for example, examples in Bristol where one school was charged £8,000 just to refit a blind. We've seen a massaging of reality in many of these contracts, and that's not been cost effective for the British taxpayer. It also puts public services at risk, because when these companies fail, public services fail, and government needs to be directly accountable to the public, and by putting companies in the way of that, it affects that accountability. That's not to say that in certain situations government might want to contract services from private organisations where it doesn't have the capability to do that itself, but it needs to do it on terms that are cost efficient and effective for the British taxpayer. That's not what we've seen.
Well, I mean, the difficulty surely is that there'll be patients watching, there will be teachers watching, parents and the rest of it, who will say, look, if it weren't for this system, we wouldn't have a new school, we wouldn't have a new hospital, we'd still be languishing in the boondocks. Do you really want the state to go back to this slow build of infrastructure and hospitals and schools?
We certainly can't have a slow build. I mean, we have to build the most radical programme of infrastructure upgrades that a generation has seen to make sure that we compete with other countries on the world stage. Now, the government has a clear role to play in that. It can use its own services and its own abilities to do that.
But you're not suggesting the state can do this on its own.
No,
it has to do it in...
Well, I said that earlier. I said it's not to say that the government...
So what is the new structure to be?
Well, the government will procure services from private companies where it doesn't have the ability to do it itself, but it's important to protect public services so that we don't have the stoppage of public services in schools, prisons, hospitals going forward, and there needs to be a degree of control. Now, the government, we've said, needs to step in and bring these contracts back in-house so that we regain that control, and we also bring costs down for the taxpayer, because we've seen the cost of failure in the example that Carillion has given us.
Right. Well, Rebecca Long-Bailey, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
So today, the Carillion blame game. The world has not fallen in yet, but the horror of the company Carillion going bust, with, we now know, a mere £29 million in the bank, with so many contracts in operation, so many smaller suppliers unpaid, so much unfunded pension commitment and so many workers' jobs dependent on it, all while it has found the money in the recent past to handsomely reward its executives and make big dividend payments. The government knows the optics don't look good and has asked for an accelerated investigation into the actions of the directors. Jeremy Corbyn thinks it makes a bigger point about trying to contract everything out. Time to bring it in-house, he says. But for the moment, contract rule in the public sector, from prisons and schools, you can also see train franchises as the same thing. Some private companies make a mint, others, as Carillion knows, operate on dangerously thin margins. So is it possible for contracting out to ever work smoothly? Well, here's Helen Thomas.
30,000 businesses, hundreds of millions of pounds owed. Across the country, companies working on Carillion's private sector jobs are wondering what happens when government support ends. Then the scale of the damage from the company's dramatic collapse could start to become clear. But there are tough questions starting to be asked here in Westminster. About a third of government spending goes through external suppliers. So has the government got a good handle on who's building its roads and hospitals or providing crucial public services? And have past lessons about the pitfalls of dealing with private companies been learned? About £250 billion of government spending goes through external suppliers, according to estimates from the National Audit Office. £136 billion of that is spending by central government departments and the NHS. But the NAO notes government has no clear figure for the amount it spends through commercial relationships. Decisions about what to outsource and how are often made within different departments. One concern is that there hasn't been enough central management of the whole process. Open book accounting clauses in contracts give the government access to confidential information that helps track what's happening to the taxpayers' pounds. But a survey in 2014 found only 31% of contracts had open book clauses. And for only 19% of contracts had the government received the relevant data and taken steps to verify it. A 2014 report by the Public Accounts Committee recommended open book accounting to help scrutiny, greater transparency and better information on contracts and their performance, focus on encouraging new and smaller entrants in to boost competition, investment in developing Cabinet Office and departmental expertise, and, crucially, contingency plans on all contracts should a supplier fail. A follow-up by the committee chaired by Meg Hillier in 2016 called the pace of change disappointing.
We see repeatedly the same things: failure of contract letting, failure of contract management, and companies that promised more than they could deliver for the price. So really there is still a very long way for government to go. The system isn't working. There are too few large companies bidding for these contracts. They get good at bidding, but there's no guarantee that being good at bidding is actually good at running the service.
But companies in the sector would agree that change is needed. Years of austerity and the drive to cut costs has put the sector under pressure. This chart shows operating profit margins for the UK construction sector. Construction was the part of Carillion's business which generated the most losses, and the largest contractors have been making lower margins still, argue industry bodies. AMA Research puts the industry standard profit margins at 2 to 3% in construction and maybe 3 to 5% in support services. But the reality is that those remain a target for some in a sector littered with profit warnings and restructurings. One former executive told me that margins had come under pressure across all outsourcing sectors. And that's happened as companies have been asked to take on more risk and as some contracts had become impossibly complicated. A less flexible client, the government, had also made it harder to react as problems arose. It's time, this person said, for a fundamental rethink.
The government has been developing an increasingly sophisticated appreciation that the lowest bid is not necessarily the best bid. But it's quite difficult for ministers to go to Parliament and say, oh, we've gone for a more expensive bid here because we thought it was a better bid. But I think maybe this instance will liven Parliament to the need to look more, for government to look more intelligently at these bids.
With promises of hearings and inquiries, dealings between the government and its biggest suppliers will soon be getting much more scrutiny.
Helen Thomas there. Well, look, we asked the government to join us tonight, but there was nobody available. However, we have our panel of Newsnight experts here to make sense of this. Political editor Nick Watt, business editor Helen Thomas, who you've just heard, and our policy editor Chris Cook. Nick, what are you hearing tonight about where this is going?
Yes, well, I understand that tonight the government is planning to extend the 48-hour period in which it will fund the official receiver to look at private contractors, what are known as the private sector counterparties to Carillion, to see whether they want to basically accept the termination of contracts or whether they want to pay for the ongoing costs. I'm hearing talk in Whitehall. There have been talks with the Treasury. They want to be flexible. It is taking time to go through these contracts, so they want to give them more time, but this will not be indefinitely.
Right.
And
they won't call it a bailout. They won't say it's a bailout.
And it won't be the same as the support they're providing for the official receiver for the public sector.
But this is for contracts in which the government has no stake, no nothing. It's just they're basically helping the receiver sort those contracts.
They want to extend that 48-hour period.
Okay. Helen, on other aspects of this whole thing, where is it all going to go now?
Also, it will take time for us to figure out where the pain's going to come in the supply chain. So just who is going to lay off people, and there will be layoffs, and who might be taking financial hits. As we touched on earlier, Greg Clark, the Business Secretary, has actually called for 2 investigations today, one into Carillion's accounts and its reporting in the run-up to its profit warning last July, and also into sort of conduct towards its collapse, including by current and former directors. But I think we should assume that every aspect of this will be probed. You know, corporate governance in the company, that would include pay, that would include board oversight. And you know, there are various people around politics today, you know, promising to have people in front of committees and for them to be pretty fiery. you know, there will also be this lingering question of should the government have been more aware of what was going on across the Carillion business. And there are some oddities. A rival company called Interserve back in 2014 actually launched a legal challenge to the award of a contract by the Ministry of Defence. It was £4 billion worth. The contracts went to Carillion, and this rival called the bids abnormally low and suggested they could be undeliverable.
Abnormally low?
Yes.
Right. Worth knowing that. OK, Chris, Whitehall insiders will have been having lots of conversations about the meaning of this today. Probably a lot of those conversations will not be agreeing with Jeremy Corbyn. It's the end of outsourcing. What are they saying about it all and how important a moment this is?
So I think they don't think this is the end of outsourcing. That's quite clear. I mean, the big thing that I keep hearing about is concentration. They all keep bringing up it's really frustrating how concentrated the market is within outsourcing. There are relatively few players who are of a scale large enough to take on the kinds of contracts that the government likes to deliver. They also think that things are currently sort of in hand. They think the pensions are going to be dealt with by the Pension Protection Fund. They think the public contracts will be picked up and will be OK. There are obviously problems with the supply chain. But this isn't a sort of Lehman Brothers catastrophe. The real problem for them in the short term is that actually, if you look at the Serco share price, it's gone up.
Serco, the big rival to
exactly.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
Because things are a bit easier for them, there's one fewer player in the market who can bid for them. That's one of the big problems for Whitehall.
So are they foreseeing big changes now to outsourcing? A big?
Not in the short term. Not under this government. I think a big thing worth remembering is that there are reasons why people outsource that aren't just about chiselling at cost, about do you have the strategic capacity to do something? Right. The civil service does not want to manage, does not have to have a senior manager in charge of doing HR for the people who maintain their own buildings. I mean, they're not interested in that and they can't foresee doing that.
Chris, thanks, all of you. Thank you very much. Well, I'm joined now by Dame Margaret Hodge, the Labour MP who used to chair the Public Accounts Committee. Very good evening to you. And do you think the collapse of Carillion is a sign of a system working, that a company that perhaps wasn't very well run has gone out of business? That happens. Or is it a sign of some systemic failure?
I think it's more a sign of a systemic failure. And we looked at this 3 or 4 years back, and I don't think much has changed. In fact, according to Meg Hillier, it hasn't. What we found were a number of things that actually what the government was doing in trying to create a market, it was almost destroying the market because it was killing off a lot of smaller suppliers of public services and allowing these very big oligopoly sort of companies who were very good at winning contracts to run public services which they were less good at. We also found there isn't enough transparency. If you can sort this out, I think there are ways through. If you want to play in the public sector market and you're using taxpayers' money, you ought to be open. So you shouldn't be able to hide behind commercial confidentiality.
That's up to government, isn't it? Government can say we're going to make it open,
well,
and
indeed,
then you'll bid on that basis.
And
right.
and actually, when we talked to 4 of the big players 3 or 4 years ago, they were prepared to do that. National Audit Office should go in and look at them. And the other thing is we should create a market. And the other thing is the civil service capability, which we all know it simply isn't there. It's unrealistic to think we're going to get rid of outsourcing. Over half of the services now provided by the taxpayer, this is not sort of, tax reliefs or benefits or pensions, but the services, over half are provided by private providers. You can't shift back to a different system.
What is interesting is your leader, Jeremy Corbyn, has used the word fleecing the public. It fleeces the public because the companies take big profits out of the delivery of public services. It honestly doesn't sound like they're taking very big profits. I mean, Carillion was struggling to survive on the price. Which is the problem? Their margins are razor thin, or that their margins are too fat?
I think, can I deal with the ideology first? There's too much ideology around it. Among the Conservatives, there is an ideology. They believe the private sector can deliver more efficiently. Chris Grayling is probably the leading proponent of this, and you've seen the disastrous privatisation of the probation service. That's an example. On the left, there's an ideology that it's always got to be the public sector that delivers, and that, I think, becomes too producer-led. What we really need is to think about the user, the citizen, the patient. So let me give you an example. It's much easier for me to go and get my flu jab from Boots. Is that outsourcing? Is it privatisation? Actually, it works for me as a citizen, and we ought to think about how we can construct these services. But that's the real public sector reform.
There's a big point here, which is outsourcing is linked to the gig economy. big, respectable companies push something like cleaning or catering into agencies that don't give pensions, have maybe much shorter contracts with their staff. Gig economy is the result. You don't feel that whole thing has gone too far, that whole marketisation of all these aspects of life?
Oh, yeah, no, indeed I do. I think we've got to make this work because there's too much out there that is delivered through private companies. So I think you've got to have the transparency, you've got to create a market, and that means the government changing the way it tenders. If you're a small company, there's no way that you can go through that very expensive process that they've got. You've got to skill up the civil service, and then you've got what I call ethical standards on behalf of these big companies, and that I think involves things like making sure they employ people properly. We ought to be regulating codes of practice, pay their taxes, all that sort of thing. Don't lie about how they're actually delivering their services. And I think if we did that, outsourcing could work better, but we've also got to move from the ideology, private bad, private public good, and we've got to move to putting the citizen at the heart of delivering our services.
Margaret Hodge, editors, thank you very much indeed.
Tom Newton-Dunn and Aisha Hazarika, and we're going to pick up on the Carillion stories, which again makes the front pages of several of the newspapers. You picked out the Metro. I'm not going to take the risk of saying that headline again, but essentially it's focusing on a very serious story there, isn't it? It's focusing on the kind of money and bonuses that some at the top of the company got, while now workers are concerned about even having a job or getting paid at all.
Absolutely, and this is a great, front page taking the piece. It kind of will capture the anger that a lot of workers and actually the public will feel about the fact that these bosses have, run this company into the ground. There are thousands of people whose jobs are on the line, and there's going to be a knock-on effect of probably thousands of businesses that they worked with who may never get their money back and may face bankruptcy as well. But the bosses are, got big bonuses. They have sort of disappeared, and there's a picture here of one of them who has this sort of ski chalet. And again, the contrast between the bosses and the workers is very, very stark. I'm sure the bosses will be, very upset about what's happened to their company, but they're all right, Jack. They made sure they got big bonuses. That optic is very reminiscent, actually, of Philip Green with his yacht after BHS collapsed. And there were, thousands of workers worried about their pensions and jobs, and you can see the opulence that some have. But look, there are huge questions that need to be explored about Carillion and this failure. And it's a huge corporate failure. It's probably the biggest corporate failure we've seen since the banking crisis. There are questions about, what did the banks know? Because the banks knew that something was up a while ago. Why did the government continue to give them contracts to run public services when they knew that there were profits warning? Why did KPMG, the auditors, give this company a clean bill of health when clearly they were in trouble? And what happened to the internal corporate governance which allowed the remuneration committee to sign off these huge bonuses when there were all these profit warnings and things were going wrong? So this is a huge scandal. It will have a huge knock-on effect, and there'll be big political ramifications. Labour is calling for these bosses to give back their bonuses, and it raises the issue of privatising public services.
Yeah, and as you say, so many issues, not just looking at what went wrong, but also what should happen in the future with similar contracts. On the issue of the bonuses, first of all, as Aisha was saying there, Jeremy Corbyn saying they should give those bonuses back. I mean, do you think he's right saying that?
Well, Richard Howson is the chap there on the front page of the Metro and a few other papers, and that's his chalet there in the French Alps. He's the guy who was relieved of his services in October last year when Carillion was very close indeed to going to the wall. Obviously, it's just gone to the wall 2-3 months later. And he walked away with a £660,000 golden goodbye. Part of his contract, we understand, is still being paid out in instalments, and contractually, that money has to continue. It is, for me, almost now inconceivable that he's going to get all of that money. The public pressure is already building to the point that the government, who were a little bit slow-footed on this yesterday, today they came out and said, actually, now we are examining how we're going to look at certainly going after the directors to punish them if there was any wrongdoing, banning them for future directorships, and potentially, if we can get some of this money back, that they all seem to be trousering left, right and centre. I think to go into just one or two of Aisha's points, we've got to be slightly careful packaging all this up as a political failure, a government failure. Companies go wrong. Sometimes they don't work. Sometimes they've got to go bust. And that's right. That's what happens in capitalism. Not every company works. When companies are this big and the consequences of their failings are so large, that's when the government has to be ready. And quite frankly, it's not doing a bad job to step in and protect people, the people who work for public services getting paid. However, what you do also have to do if you're the government is, if there is wrongdoing, if failure is being rewarded, with this bloke still going skiing whatever he wants, his lovely chalet, that has to be stopped. And the panels of BHS were really interesting. That was, the corporate failure was manifest there. The government promises new rules, being very, very tough to come in and make sure that if there was wrongdoing, people go to prison for it.
But what about the government
That has to happen
themselves?
here.
Because the other point that Aisha was making about contracts being awarded to this company after a profits warning, awarded by the government.
See, again on that, I haven't got a problem with. And I'll tell you exactly why. The government had 450 different contracts with Carillion. I mean, that you could argue about by saying, well, why are you putting so many eggs in one basket? But, you know, this was an enormous company doing apparently not a bad job. They had 450 of those contracts. Since July, which is the first profit warning, they only signed 8 different contracts. By the way, one of those government contracts was the Labour-run Leeds Council.
So it was a lot of money.
But those contracts start with joint ventures with other companies who could come in and pick up the mess. But secondly, the last thing you want to do, really, to a company that's in financial trouble is deprive them of income, because you are guaranteed
those contracts could keep the company going.
Unless you try.
2 points on that, I would say. I think you hit the nail on the head when you said sometimes businesses go wrong and they fail, and that's capitalism. I completely agree with that. I've worked in businesses myself, which had issued profits warnings. That's part of business. The difference is they were not delivering vital public services, which can't just fail. There's a difference between a business failing, a commercial entity, and public services failing when the state then needs to step in.
Well, that's what's happening, though. The state is stepping in and doing not a bad job of it so far. It's very worrying for people, but the state is there.
But that is why people are worried, because this happening on such a big scale, you can't sort of say, hooray, this is great, the state stepped up. In that case, I don't think
it is good the state's stepping up.
No, but I don't think it's a good thing that so many contracts were given. I mean, why have you got a situation now where school meals are going to have to be
8 contracts out of 450 were given.
Loads of contracts are given in terms of this stuff, and also the government, when it's taxpayers' money, should be watching these contracts, particularly with private ones, with eyes like a hawk, because there is a record of failure in terms of these PFIs going wrong. And by the way, this is not just a party. Labour got into trouble with a lot of PFIs as well. These PFIs have got a massive history of going wildly out of control, and the government then having to come and pick up the pieces.
OK, let's turn your attention back on the company for the moment, because the front of the Financial Times talks about how much money, how much cash it had, £29 million, they say, and given the size of the company, that's not an awful lot when you're paying out to loads of different suppliers.
The FT have done a very good job digging into some of the insolvency documents to get to the bottom of precisely how big the problem was. And they found that there was only 29 million quid of cash left in Carillion's bank account. It sounds a lot to you and I, but you also find out here that from the FT's front page that £1.3 billion was owed to the banks. And in fact, if Carillion had been trading for one more day, they would be £29 million into the red. So they were in dire parlous, financial states. And Aisha does have a point. Where was the regulation? Why was this not looked at a bit closer? How could they have built up debts at £1.3 billion, all of which are going to be questions that will have to be answered?
Indeed. And we'll move on, if that's all right, Aisha. But, questions over whether or not companies like that should have the same kind of regulations that perhaps banks do or something after the financial crash.